I chose to do my presentation on the United States justice system. And I chose our country because I wanted to know more about it. So it's good for me to research policing, trial, sentencing, appeal process, and punishment more in depth because I didn't know a lot about it before. So this project was good for me. So we'll start with policing. I've got all my research from justice.gov, which is a really informative website. And this quote, I really liked it. It says, "For many individuals, interactions with the police are rare. Therefore, the average individual may not be fully aware of how a police department functions or the roles and responsibilities of police officers in ensuring public safety." And I liked that because it made me not feel as bad for not really knowing a whole lot about it already. But there are many agencies on the local, state, and federal levels that determine how effective our criminal justice system is. And police are the visible representation of our justice system to the general public. So I guess, it just talked about how the police department is how the general public views the effectiveness of what our criminal justice system is doing. So I found that to be interesting and true. Because, that's what we see as people. But I think police have one of the, if not the most difficult job of all, because they are constantly judged on how they handle situations, at least, especially like in the media and on news these days and things. They're, and just in the judgmental world that we live in, they never get a break. I feel like everyone expects them to be the authoritative figures in society that they are, but also have the ability to use force, but not use it because that's mean. And then be respectful to community members, arrest the bad guys, but not get killed in the process, and do a whole bunch of other things and please every single person in the process. So that's an impossible task. And the police community relationship is really an important one. And I found on justice.gov Peel's 9 principles of policing. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but we can look at number 1. It says the basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder. Number 2, the ability of the police is to perform their duties. The ability of the police to perform their duties is dependent upon public approval of police actions. And number 3, police must secure the willing cooperation of the public in voluntary observance of the law to be able to secure and maintain the respect of the public. So while I was reading just those first 3, it made me think of like relating police officers to babysitters and how they're babysitting like children from hell, basically, because I feel like police do, or at least, they should do so much for our society, and society acts however it wants to. Like, we should be respectful because that's the right thing to do, but oftentimes we aren't, and we act like children. I think that's a big reason our world is the way it is. It's not the fault of the policing that makes the world how it is. It's the thought process of society. We look at number 5. It says police seek and preserve public favor, not by catering to the public opinion, but by constantly demonstrating absolute impartial service to the law, which is good. And number 9, the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with it. So I've learned this semester that crime and disorder is basically inevitable. It happens. It's going to happen. And it basically will always happen. But it just sounds like the worst babysitting job in the world. It's like they're saying you only get paid if our millions of 2-year-olds don't make a mess. Yeah, right. And worst part is that it's a never-ending babysitting job. They do their job every single day. They don't get to just go home and never babysit those kids anymore. Man, makes it sound like I hate babysitting, but I do like kids. But anyways, so now we are going to talk about the hierarchical structure of policing. So there is an executive leader at the top, which is the chief of police, And depending on the size of the department or the number of units or divisions in an agency will vary. So typically there's two sections, which you see patrol and investigation here. And the public interaction happens with the patrol officers. In larger geographic areas, it'll be separated into geographic districts, which will be, and those districts are policed by a number of officers, which you see at the bottom of the screen, and they're led by the district commander, who is oftentimes the most knowledgeable of all the crime pattern and other things in the given neighborhood that they are over. Okay, and now we're going to talk about priorities. So at the local level, the police chief and the culture of the department influence the patrol and community policing practices. The mayors, council members, community leaders, and other elected officials influence what the department considers as local policing priorities, but ultimately the community members are going to influence policing priorities. The interactions that community members have with the officers and also the complaints that are made and sent in influence what officers will pay attention to. And once word gets to the police supervisors of the complaints and what's going on, that will influence what they're telling the officers to patrol and pay specific attention to. And then talking about calls for service, I found this one interesting because it's something I've always wondered about. So basically, it's like 911 calls. So the call taker works, once they've answered the phone, they have to work to determine the seriousness of an emergency, as well as determine the time, location, and just basic information so they can decide what type of response is needed. I feel like this job is really hard too, because they also have to consider whether a violent crime or a property crime is committed, if anyone is in danger at the scene, if anyone at the scene needs medical attention, if there are weapons involved, if the offender is still at the scene, if the incident is domestic in nature, or if anyone involved is experiencing a mental health crisis. So based on all of that information, the call takers are trained to prioritize calls and send the information to the police or the fire dispatcher to go and tend to the emergency in the most appropriate way. A quote that I found on justice.gov says, "Emergency calls are not necessarily dispatched on a first come, first served basis," which is what I had always wondered, I guess. Police, fire, and medical personnel will be dispatched sooner to an unfolding or more severe incident than to lower priority incidents, even if the lower priority incident happened first. Response times are also based on the number of pending calls. Police will respond more quickly to a call for service if there are fewer emergency calls pending. Response time can vary based on the time of day and number of units available, etc. Close quote. So that's all for policing. Now we'll talk about trial. So this is where the facts of the case are presented to a jury and they decide if the defendant is guilty or not guilty of the charge. So trial is a very structured process. The prosecutor begins with an opening statement to tell a brief account of his side, and then uses witnesses and evidence to present the case to prove to the jury, to try to prove to the jury that the defendant is guilty of crime. But there's also an attorney who represents the defendant, and he also tells his side, beginning with an opening statement, and then uses witnesses and evidence to present the case, his side of the case. There's a judge involved in trial, which acts as a referee, like in sports. So the ref or the judge doesn't take sides, but is an impartial person and makes sure that there's fair play. So the judge is in charge of the trial and decides what evidence may be shown to the jury. And then objections can be made, and either attorney can object a question or a piece of evidence. And then the judge decides the outcome of the objection. So the judge will either sustain the objection, which stops the action from continuing, or overrule the objection, which will allow the action to continue. And then closing arguments is a final opportunity for the prosecutor and the defense attorney to speak to the jury. It allows them to summarize the testimony and evidence that has been presented to the jury, and then also allows both attorneys to ask the jury to return a verdict of guilty or not guilty. So then the jury deliberates, and no one involved with the trial can contact the jury without a judge and lawyers. And then after the jury reaches an agreement on the verdict, they read the verdict in open court. And if the defendant is found not guilty, they're usually free to go home. If they're found guilty, the U.S. Marshals Service is actually present to prevent harm to that the defendant might cause either to the judge or the jury or other people in authoritative positions. And then the defendant is taken into custody. So on to the sentencing. So the defendant returns to court a few months after he's found guilty to be sentenced. The judge does the sentencing, and the United States Sentencing Commission has established sentencing guidelines which recommends certain punishments for certain crimes. The judge will refer to pre-sentence report and statements from victims, defendants, and the lawyers to aid in their decision-making process. Factors that are considered for the sentence include whether the defendant has committed the same crime before, or if they've expressed regret for the crime, and then and also just the nature of the crime itself. Okay, and then the appeal process happens if the defendant believes that he was wrongly convicted or if the sentence was too harsh. He can appeal to the circuit court. And I didn't know that they could do that even after they were ruled as guilty, but I guess that makes sense. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an appeal. But the appeal process is not another trial. It's just an opportunity given to the defendant to try to specifically point out the errors in the trial. However, the appeals are very difficult and can oftentimes return to trial court. Appeals are granted if the appeal court decides it is necessary because there was indeed a mistake made. If the circuit court's judge says no, the defendant can appeal to the United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. This court is the highest appellate court in American court system, and which means that they have the final say whether the defendant's appeal is granted or rejected. And they don't have to see the case. If the case makes it to them, they get to pick and choose, and they only see a few cases yearly. Okay, and then lastly, we have punishment. This includes, sorry, I skipped a page. So the sentencing process from the judge decides the punishment assigned to the defendant, whether it's going to be like community service or a allotted amount of years in jail or prison, or if they're sentenced to life. No punishment needs a jury involved except for one, which is the death penalty, which makes sense because you're ending a life. The death penalty can only be assigned to a defendant who has convicted a capital offense. You can see this on the screen. Those include murder, treason, genocide, and the killing or kidnapping of a congressman, the president, or Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court has ruled under the United States Constitution that sentencing a death penalty to anyone under 18 years of age at the time the crime was committed, or to the mentally challenged, is a cruel and unusual punishment. So that wraps up what I found, and I was able to learn a lot from this project. And criminal justice is a really fun major that relates to real life, which makes it really interesting for me, and I'm really enjoying it. So my resources are listed here, and yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day. Thanks.